And I think what China wants is primarily to have a stable world. And that civilizational state, as you know, is based on harmony. Can China maintain that harmony internally and then internationally, given that it is also a growing economy and its appetite for resources will be huge? And I think that's the biggest threat. When it wants resources, will it do it in a way that allows it to rise peacefully and not disadvantage others? And I've said this to Chinese officials whenever I met them, particularly to do with resources in Africa, Southeast Asia, fisheries, etc.
欢迎来到本期视频。先介绍一下背景啊，主持人艾瑞克·奥兰德是美国人，15岁开始学中文，1985年在美国念高中时就在华人电台打工。1989年他第一次去中国，后来他在 CNN、BBC、France 24都工作过，可以说是一个拥有非常完整西方媒体背景，很了解西方叙事，但同时也很了解中国的西方记者。他长期待在发展中国家，观察第三世界的发展状态，从东南亚的渔村到非洲的矿区，他亲眼看到了西方媒体镜头之外的真实世界。他很早就意识到所谓的中国威胁论在发展中国家根本没人买账。后来他创办了中国全球南方项目，专门记录这些被西方主流媒体忽略的声音。嘉宾是钱德兰奈尔，是马来西亚印度裔东南亚政治思想家，罗马俱乐部执行委员。他本人就扎根于发展中国家，对东南亚的政商生态、资源博弈和社会发展有极其深入的观察。他反复指出一个事实：西方那套高消费、高负债的发展模式，对全球南方来说既不可复制，也不可持续。他最近出了本新书叫《理解中国》，书里有一个观点：西方对中国的焦虑不是因为中国做了什么，而是中国已经来了。用他的话说，中国不需要成为美国，但西方必须接受一个非白人、非西方的文明型国家已经坐在了餐桌上。好了，话不多说，我们来看正片吧。
Well, China's opening up and modernization has brought enormous wealth and improved the quality of life of its people. It's also triggered a lot of anxiety in other parts of the world, namely in the US and Europe, where a lot of people feel that China's rise has been at their expense. But do you understand where the anxieties come from in the West, particularly for the working class that feel that they have lost their jobs, they're less competitive now, and that anxiety is legitimate in the US and West? Certainly it's been politicized, no doubt, but do you and the other authors recognize some of the concerns that have been brought about from China? In fact, the IMF came out recently and said that 4% of China's GDP has been allocated to subsidies. Now, those are numbers that in other countries, again, they find that objectionable. There's no debate that all countries subsidize their industries to some extent or another. But I guess in terms of legitimately understanding maybe the depoliticized concerns of working class and other people in Europe and US who feel that China has somehow gotten ahead at their expense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do understand it, but I don't necessarily agree with it. Particularly someone like me, who's comes from Southeast Asia, a citizen of a former colony. And those of us who are all citizens of former colonies, we don't take kindly to the view that suddenly the West, in particular, who represent less than 15% of the world population, suddenly feel they're getting a raw deal. Well, we got a raw deal for 4 centuries. And so that sort of doesn't sit comfortably with my analysis, nor do I think it sits comfortably with any of us, including my colleagues at the Club of Rome, that is something to be, we can understand it, but the political climate in the West. And I was asked this question in an interview I did about the book a few weeks ago, where I was said, why don't they understand China? And I said, the political elite actually understand. Not only do they understand China, they understand the world has changed. What they have is great fear that the privileges they have enjoyed, and this I'm making a political point, but I think in relation to your question, it's important that after 4 centuries of dominance and essentially almost entitlement, they're now faced with another civilization, a non-Caucasian one, dare I say, and that's been echoed by U.S. administrators, that they don't understand China because for the first time they're confronted with a non-Caucasian civilization. And that was actually stated by a black member of the administration under Biden, that they're confronted with a civilization that is not Western, and for the first time in 400 years, they have to partner with others who are non-Western either. So people understand all over the world. But, do I worry and should we strategically be thinking about and worrying about a small segment of the global population when 85% of the global population, not all, but a great majority of them do not have a fraction of the quality of life that even someone in the United States who is at the lower rung of the economic ladder has? And clearly one also has to appreciate that the privileges are still essentially those that are part of an imperial past. And you can talk to Africans about how Francophone Africans still dominated by France. You can talk about all the colonies, etc. And I say the hegemonic actions of the United States using tariffs, etc. So I understand, but, Europeans and Americans have got to come to the party, and it's a new world. And the others are arriving, and you have to accept that. And China is one of the first to essentially arrive and say, we're here. Now, the challenge will be, will China make sure, as you know, rise peacefully? And that's really the most important thing that we have to contend with. But it has a right to its economic policies, including the way it plays with subsidies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that rise and peacefully. This brings up a question in many parts of Europe and the U.S. as to what does China want? There is a perception in many parts of the West that China wants to replace the United States as the world's dominant hegemonic power. You make the case in the book that that is not the case. You mentioned here that China is not expansionist. So let's get to the bottom line. What do you think China wants to be in the 21st century?
I think I say in the book as well, and Eric, you as, I would say, a scholar of Chinese history and geopolitics and current, notions of where China wants to go will understand. China has explicitly said that it does not want to replace the United States. It has no interest in that. But what I think I try to portray in the book is China is cognizant that it is a very big and now a very powerful country, but especially in terms of its economic clout, in terms of the impact that its growth has on other countries, both positively and also negatively, and it has to be cautious about that. And then thirdly, in terms of its technological prowess, etc. So the question for China is really, and I say in the book that China is trying to cross the river while feeling the stones, what do? We've never been in this position. Of course, it was a dominant economy about 200 years ago together with India, and we all know that. But the world was a very different place 200 years ago. There's about 1 billion people in the world. We have 8 billion people. What does this look like? And my view is China is trying to figure this out. But what I understand and try to describe in the book is that it is very, very dangerous to take a Western rationale that has shaped the way of understanding how the world operates, a rationale that was steeped in domination and hegemony, and then say others are going to behave the same like we do, and just superimpose that trajectory of dominance. And I have said this before, that one of the concerns, and we need leaders in the United States and Europe to arise, new leaders, who begin to reflect that not everyone's going to behave like us, and dismantle this fear that others will do to us what we did to them. And I think what China wants is primarily to have a stable world, and that civilizational state, as you know, is based on harmony. Can China maintain that harmony internally and then internationally, given that it is also a growing economy and its appetite for resources will be huge? And I think that's the biggest threat. When it wants resources, will it do it in a way that allows it to rise peacefully and not disadvantage others. And I've said this to Chinese officials whenever I met them, particularly to do with resources in Africa, Southeast Asia, fisheries, etc.
Yeah. Very quickly before we go, because we're running short on time, I do want to circle back to the United States, because you do come back to this in the book about the risk of escalation. The mood in the U.S. today is that basically they want a divorce from China. For the most part, the political elites, and even now increasingly the corporate elites, will say, we're done. We don't want to have this relationship. Now, you can't untangle the relationship entirely, given that it's the largest trading relationship in the world. But nonetheless, there is this sentiment in the United States that says we're kind of finished. And obviously your book addresses this and when it talks about the pressures of economic decoupling. But it also talks about the risks of miscalculation that may exist on both sides. Very quickly, how do you assess those risks of miscalculation between the U.S. and China today and where we are?
I think the miscalculation is simply, what we don't want a hot war, and we don't want the tariff war. I mean, it was interesting that the FT said that, and the Chinese and others have said this for at least close to a year since the tariffs came to place, that we will live through this. We will not bow. But the FT headlines, the front pages, is that China has won. But partly because its ability to take pain. The United States and most of Europe is unable to take pain because of the cycle of elections, etc. Politicians have to appease populations to put them back in place. So I think the pain, the risk are war, and I think here. And again, I'm being more biased, and you've asked me a question about my view of the geopolitics.
Sure.
I think China has been extremely well behaved in putting up lots of provocation and not falling for the bait. That's the first one. The second is the economic war. And I think, as we can see now, even in the United States, the Supreme Court has said it's illegal. Maybe the tide's beginning to turn, that people are understanding that this is not in the U.S. interest. I'm not sure I agree, Eric, but you may have better points of contact, that corporate America wants to decouple from China. I mean, corporate America is essentially the definition of, what the capitalist beast looks like and where there's money to be made.
They're finding it more difficult to make money in China because China is much more competitive than it was 15, 20 years ago when they first went in. Take, for example, the auto industry. U.S. automakers are a fraction of what they were 10 years ago because Chinese automakers are so formidable.
Yeah, so that's basically the whole globalization, what they teach you at Harvard Business School, isn't it? That you compete, you lose. And if you lose, you find different markets. And I think it's very clear. You mentioned auto, and 10 years ago, I remember going to the Beijing Auto Fair, and there was about probably 3 or 4 Chinese car manufacturers. 2 years ago or last year, I think there were a couple of few Europeans, a couple of Americans, and it was all Chinese. So that's the competition. I do think China will face problems, which we already know. As it competes, beats, and then what? Right? So I think those are the bigger macroeconomic issues, not just for China, but also for the world. But in terms of the Americans decoupling, the rest of the world, particularly in relation to what, this current administration has done, has been disabused of the merits of the American system. The mask has been taken off. And I think the Americans and Europeans, but more the Americans, have a lot of work to do to regain the trust of the rest of the world, particularly as the products are not as good, can't compete with the others, can't even compete with Koreans, let alone the Chinese. So, no one wants to see a weak United States, and certainly not a weak United States that lashes out to the rest of the world because it creates great disruption. And so, one hopes that we see through the next 3 years, and Americans will be wise enough to elect a good president. I think the problem for the United States and therefore for the world, given the power of the Americans, particularly with the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which nobody talks about when they accuse others of having subsidies, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is a global subsidy in the United States. which has been exploited and financialized, but the military hegemony too, and the sort of arrogance to use it willy-nilly anywhere around the world. So that has to change. And what the United States needs is an enlightened leader, and it's not had one for, I believe, in 40 years. And if the United States has an enlightened leader, one who says, hey, we know we're number one, and you know how difficult that is for any politician to say, but we can be partners with the best countries in the world and redefine it. That's what the new order looks like. The world will be a better place, and the United States will essentially be what the current administration wants it to be great. And that really is what I see the risk as being. And I think the rest of the world is de-risked China in terms of they don't think China is anymore the threat that the propaganda has said. Now China will have to live up also to that belief that others have, which they have cultivated. But can they sustain it? That's the other question.
Well, we close every one of our podcasts, given the name of the show is Conversation Changers, with what part of the conversation do you want to change? So what part of the conversation about China do you want to change?
Well, to put it shortly, it depends on the audience. In the West, I think the Europeans, you have a long tradition, trust China, work with China, you need China. Again, coming back to, I'm seeing a little shift in the FT and the BBC, that, my God, the world needs China for climate change reversal, right? That was quite a long analysis done, I think it was at the BBC. So Europeans, it's trust China. Don't decouple from China. But you might want to decouple a bit more from the United States so that you don't become its proxy for all these other things. For the Americans, I would say, understand that China is not a threat to the United States. You will compete, but that is not a threat. But China is not a threat to the sovereignty and the sort of homeland as such. And there's a lot to be gained by working with China. And to the rest of the world, particularly Africa, etc., my message is China is in Africa now. And it can be a good partner. It's also up to you to make sure that the Chinese are accountable as they're helping you, and that, like any country is powerful, that doesn't take advantage of you. It's up to you. And in Southeast Asia, I think the message is, we in Southeast Asia, as you know, Eric, are more familiar with Chinese civilization because Chinese civilization is the diaspora and the civilization is right across. I was brought up with Chinese people, so I don't see Chinese as who are those people. For us is to essentially also do the same thing, which is to take advantage of Chinese economic power, partnership, etc., but also be cautious to make sure that China doesn't overstretch given its size. Protect our resources, have fair deals with the Chinese, and demand that those deals work in our favor rather than succumb to economic power. But to trust that, China is not an expansionist power, and work together with it and learn from it as well, not in terms of adopting its political model, but more importantly, the things I mentioned, the emphasis on meritocracy, competence, fighting corruption very hard, and being communitarian.
好，视频看完了，我们来聊点有意思的。我想很多人都会疑惑，中国的崛起让西方害怕到天天编中国威胁论，但为什么全球南方国家却不害怕呢？答案很简单，因为光脚的不怕穿鞋的。美国怕丢霸权，欧洲怕丢产业，日本怕丢供应链，这些恐惧放在全球南方根本就不成立。如果你手里从来都没有过蛋糕，怎么会害怕别人来抢呢？西方人怕在餐桌上丢蛋糕，可全球南方国家实际上从来没上过桌。西方殖民400年，已经把国际规则写死了。在这样的秩序下，全球南方会被永远锁在原料输出地和工业品倾销地上，永远生产不了高附加值的东西，永远只能做血汗工厂和资源矿山。很多人以为美国底层很苦，可钱德兰说了一句更扎心的大实话：全球85%的人口生活质量连美国最底层的人的一小部分都达不到。这就是现实。全球南方的底层逻辑从来不是保住蛋糕，而从来都没有分到过蛋糕。所以中国一来，西方看到的是威胁，而全球南方看到的是破局的契机。区别在哪里？西方殖民者修铁路修港口，把利润抽走，把资产带走；中国的一带一路修路修港，把资产留下，帮助本地发展。前者是吸血，后者是造血。以前这套叫殖民，现在呢 当地人拿到技术，学到制造，留下产业。虽然中国目前用的是国内的淘汰产能，但放在全球南方，这是从0到1的质变，是从未拥有过的东西。这相当于换了赛道，终于可以不按西方设定的道路走了。中国的崛起打破了西方秩序等于国际秩序的垄断，全球南方第一次发现，原来这个世界可以不按照西方的规则运转。钱德兰说的那句话的真正含义是，前殖民地被不公正对待了4个世纪，好比在足球场上，在4-0的局面里，你从来都没进过球，你就不会怕对方再进一个，你怕的不是对方得分，而是自己永远没有得分的能力。中国的到来第一次给了全球南方得分的能力，这才是他们不怕的底气。不是因为他们清华，而是因为利益结构跟中国崛起的方向高度一致，他们不怕丢牌，怕的是天下永远不变。听起来很理想，对吧？但钱德兰紧接着又浇了一盆冷水，中国不能辜负自己给全球南方国家培养起来的这个信念，而且全球南方国家自己也要有能力接住这个迟来的机遇。为什么不能辜负？因为西方骂你是对手的骂，全球南方如果有一天骂你，那是战友的失望。苏联当年也是全球南方的老大哥，最后在阿富汗和东欧翻车，信用破产只用了1个10年。钱德拉的意思是，你种下了信任，就要收割责任，不然新殖民主义者的帽子迟早从西方人嘴里转到当地人的心里。全球南方不是你的后院，是你的合伙人。合伙人容易上船，也容易跳船。如果和平崛起不只是口号，而是非洲港口、东南亚工厂、拉美矿山上每天都在发生的现实，那这个叙事就会变成自我实现的预言。如果做不到，那被辜负的不是西方，而是那些曾经压住你会带来公平的人。这是钱德兰对中国最温和也是最沉重的提醒。好了，这期视频就到这里了。本频道视频仅代表个人观点，欢迎大家在评论区理性交流和补充。另外，制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，感谢您动动手指，一键3连。如果您有更多的想法或建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，我都会看见。我们下期见。